If you guys can try to imagine 500, even 600 years ago in London, so we're in the Tudor period. Obviously, we don't have electricity, we don't have cars, we don't have any of the things, except for a couple of the buildings that maybe we'll cross paths with. This is a totally different period of time. It's almost hard to imagine. So if we can go back in time mentally, we are in a very different time. The center of trade in this time, whether you're talking about jewelry, textiles, whatever, is going to be Cheapside. So Cheapside is just, I don't know, if we walk maybe 30 minutes that way or something, we'd get there. So imagine, so this is the procession of King Edward VI. Now, the reason I show you this photo, if we check out what they're processing past, if we zoom in here, check out all of the silver cups, the plates, the goblets, and if they really wanted to get detailed, there'd be gems and jewels in those windows because they are walking directly down Cheapside. That is the place. So Cheapside is where you're going to find all of your jewelers, all of your goldsmiths, all of your gem cutters, all of the luxury items that people would want to get, and other stuff. Another depiction of it, and you can just see a little bit more detail of, you know, what's being offered in the windows as the procession goes by. So Cheapside was the place to be in that period of time, and London's shopping district, you know, the luxury shopping district, was well known throughout Europe. People would come to London from other places in Europe just to see and what was going on, see what's on display, see the stuff that the jewelers and the goldsmiths and everybody were making, and it was well known. So this is going on, I mean, probably even from the 1300s for about 300 years. So this whole, again, we can just imagine what it might have been looking like. You know, you're in a street with carts, with horses, with people banging on metal stuff, you know, because you can hear them, you know, the grinding of the wheel of the gem cutters, and, you know, just this kind of a period of time. So we're in the realm of King Henry VIII, we're in the realm of Elizabeth I. Not that many people could read at the time. It was not something that everybody learned. So all the shops would have different signs, and that's how you'd know, oh, I'm going to go to the Phoenix, which maybe was your local goldsmith or whatever, or maybe your baker. I don't know. So everything was having signs. You would go around and find what you needed. So the centerpiece of this Cheapside, this four-story, well, it's this building that we saw already. It's like a four-story wooden building, and you'd have merchants downstairs. They could be living upstairs or workshops upstairs, depending on how they wanted to do it. If we would go there today, the reason why I didn't make such a fuss about going over there is because there isn't so much to see as far as this goes. It burned down in the fire in 1666. If we would go there today, if you guys know London, you might know One New Change. That's the building that's there now. It's a huge shopping center. It's two buildings. It's not that interesting to see, and there's nothing literally there. We can kind of get a glimpse of the change. This is 100 years ago, so we still have all the little buildings along the side, and now today it's just one big, so that's a bunch of shops. Now they've just replaced it. And I want to talk about this block right here because that's where this big sort of gem building was. The district was being essentially run by the Goldsmiths Guild. The goldsmiths were very powerful at the time. We have to imagine we're at a time before banks, right? Banking did not exist at this time. So when the king wanted to go to war or do a project, he's not getting loans from banks. He's getting loans from goldsmiths because they have gold, they have money. And so the Goldsmiths Guild, which is this is the Goldsmiths Guild today, that's still there. It's just a couple blocks away from Cheapside. So if we did go to Cheapside, I would show you that. And we can see there's been a few different goldsmiths halls because they burned down and whatever. I don't know what happens to them. But, and they've got an amazing library in there full of old books, including this lapidary book, which I think says somewhere, oh, wait, where is it?
Yeah, Justin Prim will be here in 2023.
Yes. No, 1513. So this is a handwritten, they've got a ton, they've got all of their records going back to the 1300s still. Like you can go to the library and ask for them and they're all handwritten. So, you know, beautiful stuff. But the Goldsmiths Guild still exists today. It's still one of the 13 livery companies of London. It's not as important as it once was 500 years ago because 500 years ago, they were in some small way ruling the financial sector of London. But if you wanted to become a goldsmith or any kind of jeweler or even a gem cutter, you were going to be working under the dictation of their rules. Cheapside's inside of the City of London. So the City of London is the 1 square mile financial heart or commercial heart of London. We've got goldsmiths hall who are training goldsmiths, making the laws around goldsmiths, who's allowed to do it, what are the rules, in terms of hallmarking and not selling fake gold or whatever. They were the ones that were self-regulating the trade. So if you wanted to be a goldsmith, you would have to go through a training program that someone in the guild created, and then you'd become an apprentice, you'd graduate, you'd become a journeyman, and then eventually become a master goldsmith yourself. Now, the gem cutters weren't necessarily under this same exact system because the goldsmiths weren't really regulating the apprenticeship system of gem cutters, but they were regulating who was allowed to sell. Because not anyone could just sell jewelry. You had to basically you could call it a license. I don't know if it was really a license, but if you didn't have the right to sell, and especially to sell inside of the City of London from the Goldsmiths Guild, you would be kicked out. You would not be allowed to do that. So if you wanted to do business as a jeweler, selling gold, selling gems, you needed to be working in their system. And if you're going to be a gem cutter working with one of those people, you also need to be working with their system and keeping nice with everybody, just like we still have to do today, right? There was a little bit more flexibility with the cutters, but they still had to play nice with everybody else. 1666, of course, there's a big fire in London, and Cheapside is burned down, and lots of London is burned down. So after the fire, Cheapside kind of dissipated a bit as a center for the jewelers. We can see maybe what the gem cutter's office might have looked like. In this case, the gem cutter is playing a harp to, to romance his customer. But you can see that on the table he's got stones. But notice the grinding wheel here. That's actually pretty accurate. And he's got the scales over here. This one's from Germany, but this one is actually from London. And we can see another idea of the lapidary merchant. And if you look behind here, we've got this weird looking thing. I've showed this to lots and lots of people. Nobody knows what it is. But when I first saw it, I was like, oh, this is a diamond cutting mill.
Yeah,
exactly a diamond cutting mill. If you see a picture of a diamond cutting mill from this time, they look identically like that. The weird little handle throws you off. It's like perspective, but that's the thing that somebody would push to turn the wheel around. So this is a London merchant with his shop in the back. In this period of time, 17th century or 16th century, anything before that, as far as British gem cutting goes, we don't really have any hard documents. We don't have any machines. We don't have anybody saying this is what people are doing. And we can kind of get an idea about the kind of designs they were doing because some of the stones still exist. Like, for instance, if you go into the V&A, there's lots of old stuff. I want to talk about the Cheapside hoard. So going back to Cheapside, before the fire, as we said, there's that big, beautiful building and the whole neighborhood around it that's just the jewelry district. Before One New Change got built, this is what it looked like. This is like about 100 and so years ago. And notice it's all these individual buildings. So in 1910, they're renovating some of these buildings and they pull up the floor in one of them and they discover a classic treasure box, right? Like 300 or 400 pieces of gold, jewelry, loose gems, amazing stuff. Nobody has any idea where it's come from. The Museum of London buys it and never puts it on display for whatever reason. Here's some of the stuff that they found. The Cheapside hoard is really, really cool because since we don't know the types of machines people were using or specifically the techniques that they were using to cut them, finding stones that maybe were cut in London at this time or cut somewhere in Europe gives us a good idea about what they could do. Notice, if you look closely, this are all rose-cut garnets. So the rose-cut garnet if this is 1650, let's say 10 years before the fire, the cutting style would have been quite new. And when we look through and see some of the other stuff, we've got, beautiful, intricate cameos and, just very nice work. You can imagine being a construction worker and just open this box like, the amazing thing is that they didn't just steal it. They went and, I guess they sold it, so whatever. But anyway, so, just really amazing pieces. And a lot of the stuff that's in the cheapside hoard, when we really look at the designs, they're not the design, I'm talking about the gemstone cutting designs. They're not the designs of the kinds of things that we see today. A lot of the, I've looked pretty extensively at some of the photos. A lot of the cutting patterns that they're using are not documented at all, nowhere. Like the cheapside hoard is the only place to see some of these things.
The emerald.
Yeah, and of course the emerald watch is the highlight. This is an amazing, this is about this big. It's a solid emerald that they hollowed out and made a watch out of. But, just really an incredible find that gives us a little glimpse into what gem cutting would have been like in the 1600s. So if we really look at the story of London's gem cutting, it's the story of people continuously coming to London from other countries bringing traditions, whether they were the Huguenots coming from France, whether they were Jews coming from Spain having got kicked out, whether they were Germans coming to sell to the king and queen, or Dutch with diamonds, London was a huge super hub of selling luxury goods because there's a rich royal family who's really into luxury jewelry, and also for all the political stuff that was going on between, the Protestant Revolution. And it's not just the Huguenots, though. The Huguenots were part of it. The Jews were part of it. The Dutch were part of it. The Germans were definitely part of it. And every time someone comes and settles, they would bring some of their skills. And then eventually, when they would get some apprentices, that foreign knowledge trickles out into London and becomes British. And that's exactly where I'm going, because we're going to go see a shop, or a place where a shop was, of one of these immigrants. But I'm not quite there yet. There is some documentation, not as early as, before the cheapside hoard, but not as early as the beginning of the story. This is 1480. This is Randall Holm. He has done this book of, it's basically like a sort of a book of flags and looking at all these different trades and their sort of logos, if we could call them that. In this book that has nothing to do with gem cutting, he diverges so many times into all these little things. And in one case, he's listing all the trades with little pictures of them, which is where we get this awesome earliest photo of a British gem cutting machine. So 1480, this is quite old. And we can see it's a big wooden table. There's gears on the bottom. There's a hand crank here. Yeah. So somebody's hand cranking, and that's their cutting wheel spinning around, and the gears on the bottom are working it. We can kind of see what it actually looks like. This is a German one from probably around the same time. There's no device. It's just a mill. There's no machine on there to hold it. So you'd be holding a stick in your hand and hand cranking one and just holding it on there pretty hard. And then they would keep this little sandbox on their desk, and that would hold either their diamond powder or their emery powder. And also, if their stone was hot from heating it up from the doping, they could throw it in there into the powder just to cool it off real quick. Shall we walk a little bit? Okay. We're speaking about immigrant cutters, right? You've got people coming in from all these surrounding neighboring countries for one reason or another. Here's the time we're in now. So we've moved up to the 1700s. Cheapside is no longer the center of the thing. It's just dispersed. In the 1700s, the jewelry trade didn't really have a focal point. It was kind of spread out. After the fire, they tried to rebuild it, but it just wasn't the same, and the goldsmiths didn't have the same power that they once did. For about 100 years, the gem trade was a bit spread out. Still in Cheapside a little bit, not quite yet in Hatton Garden, not at all in Hatton Garden actually. This is our era now. It's a little bit different. And we've got one guy, one of these immigrant cutters, Moses Haims, who this is his business card. He had a shop at 127 Pall Mall, 3 doors down from the Carlton House. That's the Carlton House. At that time, that's where the Prince Regent lived. So a bit of a ritzy place to be. 127 Pall Mall is now the Kazakhstan House. I don't think that's the original building, but I've never been able to find an old enough description to know. That's called 125 now, but it was that place. So Moses Haim, who is not British born, he's Polish. His grandparents were Polish. They were in the Polish Revolutionary War, but on the wrong side. Got kicked out of Poland, went to Ireland, or his father got married to his mother, and then they came to London when he was maybe 14 years old. I'm guessing that he would have gotten into one of the formal apprenticeships. He's Jewish, so there's already a network of Jewish gem merchants here. So maybe he went right in with them, but I'm not sure because I think he would have become a diamond cutter that way, not a colored stone cutter, but you never know. But if we look closely at his card, he tells us lots and lots of stuff. So he's cutting Brazilian pebbles for opticians for spectacles. He's making agate burnishers. He's carving and doing stuff, making pressers for bookbinders and stuff. And gentlemen taught to slit and cut stones on reasonable terms. So he's also taking apprentices. So just as we said, he's immigrated here with his parents. He's learned from other immigrants how to do whatever he's doing, and now he's going to pass it on. But what he's passing on, we couldn't really say it's British. I mean, it's here, but it's not coming from here. It's not techniques from here. Now, if we look closely, let's just say that that's him. This is what he's doing. So he's got his little, this is the same machine that Randall Holmes showed us 200 years earlier. So this is the late 1700s. So he's got his little hand crank. He's grinding his stone, or maybe he could actually be slitting it on the side with a sawing blade. He starts his business life here at 127 Pall Mall. Over the course of his career, he's got 4 different shops, and I think we can just walk to the next one, and then I'll tell you the rest of his story so we can keep moving. So this is just an idea of drawings of some of the other designs of that time. We just walked from one shop to another shop. So Moses Haim was back over there by Trafalgar Square. Then later he moves right into here, maybe into the place that is now Wasabi. Over the course of his career, he's got 4 different shops, but they're all kind of in this area along the Strand. And maybe you're already getting the idea that I'm trying to convey as we walk down the Strand. This is a major thoroughfare of commerce. Even today, of course, every single shop is stuff for sale, stuff to eat, stuff to buy. So if we go follow the Strand that way, we're going to get to Westminster. And if we keep going that way, we're going to get to City of London. So you've got the government, you've got the sort of luxury buying area and the working commerce area. And so anybody who had money and was doing good or working in the government or whatever, they'd be going back and forth maybe every day. This is their daily commute. So having a jewelry shop right here makes a lot of sense. You're gonna make some business, and you're gonna be, just like the procession going through Cheapside. That wasn't an accident. They're taking the king and his crew into the most amazing, luxurious part of the city. We're somewhere over here. Hatton Garden's up here, which is where the gem and jewelry community is today. Cheapside's over here, which is more that way. So this is that weird period of time in between where Cheapside's not really the hub anymore, and Hatton Garden's not the hub yet in the middle of the 1700s. And all these dots are gem cutters that I got from, like the census and stuff like that, or tax records.
The blue dots?
The white dots.
Okay, right.
This is just the walking path.
Yeah.
So they're all over the place, from 127 Pall Mall, where we just were, all the way over to Cheapside, even up in what is now Hatton Garden. They're everywhere, but not concentrated the way that they once were, or the way that they kind of are today. And as we go through the 1700s, they spread out even more. So this is the second half of this, or the last 20 years of the 1700s, and they're spread out even more. So if you needed to go find a gem cutter, they're not going to be all in the same area like they were, which isn't really that good for the trade. If you don't know that Moses Haim is here, you're not going to find him because he's not in the community like they once were. What we see as far as technology progressing, even Moses Haim would have had this in his shop. We saw the hand crank thing, right? Back in the 1400s, it was just a hand crank table and your stick in the hand. In the 1600s, they got this from Prague. This was originally coming from Prague. It's called a quadrant. So that wooden stick that they had would get stuck in here or in one like that. And then this thing would go on that hand crank table, and it would slide down on this pole, and that would allow the cutter to not have to hold the stick in their hand anymore and have some fixed point. So when we saw those rose cuts in the Cheapside hoard, this is how they were doing it. You can't really do a rose cut stick in hand. It's too complicated. You could, maybe you could, but I think that you probably could not. We can, if we look at the trend of gemstone designs and gemstone technology, as soon as they get this machine, the designs get very complicated. Before that, they were very simple. Regular square, step cuts, table cuts, super simple, four-sided, everything, very simple. And then once we get this device with its, it has a way to do angles, it has a way to rotate the stone. Not very well, it's crude, but it's not in your hand anymore. So if you wanted to do a rose cut or one of those crazy cheapside hoard cuts that we saw, this is the tool that was allowing them to do that. And Moses Haim, with his hand cranking thing, definitely would have had this on there, even though his business card didn't show it. We're gonna go like 2 more blocks that way, and we're gonna go into the 1800s. So we're traveling through time as we traveled the Strand. Has anyone ever heard of a guy named John Mawe, British mineralogist from the 1800s? We've just gone from the late 1700s, Moses Haim's second shop. By the way, I didn't finish his story. He had 4 shops in London, and then eventually when he was like almost in retirement age, he moved to America, and he lived in North Carolina until the end of his days, and his little trade card is now in some library in North Carolina. Very strange. So he started his days in Ireland. I think he was born in Ireland, came to London, did his whole life, and then for whatever reason, I never found out why, but he moved to North Carolina. We got one glimpse of one gem cutter there in the 1700s with his sort of immigrant knowledge, and then spreading that into the city through his apprentices that he had. So if we move forward a little bit, we're into the beginning of the 1800s. So one of the things that happens in the world of our world of the sciences, around this time, the science of mineralogy is starting to get really well organized and developed. And one of the leading figures in the UK for that is this guy named John Mawe. So John Mawe is from Derby, so he's from a few hours north of here. He was a merchant marine until he was about 21. He comes back home. He starts apprenticing with Richard Brown, who had a marble spar works in Derby. So he becomes like the star employee, and then he starts dating the boss's daughter. Could have been dangerous, but no, they got married. They came to London, and they opened a shop at 149 Strand, which is that Indian restaurant right there. Now, the cool thing about this is, since we're not going back so far in time, it is the same building. We can see from this 1850 drawing that 149 Strand, the Marble Spar Company, it is exactly that building. Oh, yeah, okay, we can imagine what it would have looked like. The only thing that's changed on that building is the black front. The top is there, and I almost imagine if we can do like an infrared photo, maybe we can still see the paint that says Marble Spar Works on there, but that is John Mawe's shop. That's King's College, Somerset House, which King's College does stuff there. So 3 doors down, 1, 2, 3, we can see with the original front with the sort of pop-out windows that aren't there anymore. But yeah, I found quite a few photos randomly where you can see the building in like the 1850s to early 1900s. So the last time I was here, this was a road. So this didn't used to be a courtyard. This used to be a road. So as you're going down the Strand, you could keep on going down here. So John Mawe also was doing the same thing that Moses Haim was doing, was just catching all of these commuters who have money. But he had a mineral shop in there. So he was doing minerals. He was traveling around Britain. He was from Derby, so he knew all about the fluorite. He would go to France and talk to gem people over there. Like, he was well-traveled. He was a mineral dealer and a mineral collector. And as I said, he put out a series of books. And this one shows us the portable lapidary apparatus. And he actually gives us this picture of the Regency era gentleman lapidary with his hand crank machine that he's got on his parlor table. So this is not a professional guy.
In clean clothes.
Yeah. So he specifically uses this phrase, the gentleman lapidary, and talks about this portable machine that you could put on your parlor table. This is not a professional device. This is like maybe the first hobbyist machine, and he was selling them in here. You can see the bottom, sold by J. Mawe, 149 Strand. So we are right there. And maybe that's supposed to be John Mawe himself. There's no pictures of him that exists. So I don't know if that's meant to be him, but we can imagine that it is. This is the exact same kind that we saw in Randall Holmes' book, and we saw Moses Haim using the hand crank machine with the wheel. We can imagine that's in there. He's inside the shop. As soon as I found out this is John Maw's shop, I had to eat there, you know. The floor is still John Maw's floor, and I'm sure that upstairs there's probably some cabinets or something that he had. But for me, here's the important thing of John Mawe. Okay, great. He's a mineralogist. He's doing wonders for the world of British gemology. He's communicating with French gem people and everything else. But for me, as a gem cutting historian person, the thing that is his biggest contribution to my research is not this picture, which while it's fun and cute, we knew that existed already. But in 1821, he puts out this picture in a new book, and notice
He shows how the angles.
we've got a new device. Now, in 1820 or 1819, this device did not exist. So in English, it's called the jam peg. Jam peg. So you've got the same hand crank box with the wheel, but now instead of that quadrant device that I showed you before, or even just the stick in the hand, you've got this wooden cone with all these holes in it, and you'd put your stick in there, and that would give you an angle. Now, this is coming from France, so the fact that we know that John Mawe is going back and forth to France all the time to meet with mineral people makes a lot of sense that he was knowing about this before anybody else, because this book came out literally 1 year after it was invented in France, and there's only one other source for this. This is the earliest image of this machine ever. So even though this is not a British machine, John Mawe was the first one to show it, but he's not the first one to talk about it, because 1 year earlier, a book comes out in France that describes it in words but no drawing. John Mawe had this right away, and he's selling it here again. And he shows us even, so this is 1821, and we can see some of the styles at the time. We're in the era of the brilliant cut now. In Moses Haim's time, he probably would have seen, in around 1750, he would have seen the first uses of the brilliant cut, especially coming into the world of colored stones. In John Mawe's time, it's quite normal. You know, we've got brilliant cuts and rose cuts and mixed cuts and step cuts and everything else. All the cuts that we have today, pretty much John Mawe had them. So John Mawe's working there with his wife. So his wife is Richard Brown's daughter, but she was also very much in the world. She was a mineral collector. She probably was cutting gems as well. He was teaching at King's College some mineralogy classes, so he was going next door and doing that. And when he died, well, I'm not quite to when he died, but when he died, she took over the shop. And when we see this image here, this is after he died. Notice it's not John Mawe, it's Sarah Mawe. So Sarah Mawe, mineralogist to Her Majesty the Queen. Once John Mawe died, she took over the company with one of their apprentices. And then later on, she received the title of mineralogist to the Queen. And they ran the shop until I think she was ready to retire. Now, before John Mawe died, he died in 1829. So in 1829, she takes over. So their apprentice was this guy named James Tennant. James Tennant, successor to Sarah Mawe, so he took over when she retired, so that we've got 3 generations now in the same shop. This is his business card, still at 149 Strand. Now, James Tennant's interesting. So he learned from John and Sarah here. He went to all the, I think that he met them through the classes in King's College. He becomes their apprentice. He partners with Sarah when John dies, and then when Sarah retires, he takes over the business. And the cool thing about James Tennant, which is this guy right here, at one point, you guys might have seen this picture, the recutting of the Koh-i-Noor.
Yeah.
He was one of the consultants, and he's probably one of these guys standing here. Maybe he's that guy. And so when they recut the Koh-i-Noor, they brought down, I can't remember their name right now, but so they brought those guys down, these Dutch cutters, but they had a British consultant to give feedback, and it was James Tennant, the successor to John and Sarah. So I don't know how long this shop was their mineral shop, but it must have been, 50 plus years. So the Indian restaurant has a long way to go if they want to really claim the ownership of that space. They recut the Koh-i-Noor. We saw this last night. If you guys went to the walking tour of the Crown Jewels, they had the model of that one. So that happened, and they're recutting it and notice the big frame diamond machine that if you now that you see it, it kind of maybe looks familiar, like the one that we saw back in Randall Holmes' book in 1450 or whatever it was. 1830, 1850, James Tennant. We're going to go 30 years into the future to 1880, but we have to go to Hatton Garden to do it. So we've gone through the Tudor era cutters of Cheapside. We've gone through the immigrant cutters of the 16 and 1700s. We've gone into the gentleman lapidaries of the early 1800s. And now, as we move into Hatton Garden, I want to bring us to the 1880s and talk a little bit about some of the last generation gem cutters that have only just ended their reign recently. If we go back to about 1890, we've got a new company forming from a guy called Charles Matthews. This is the earliest advertisement I can find. So notice 14 Hatton Garden. That was their original location, even back to 1890. Sadly, 14 Hatton Garden doesn't exist anymore. It was here. There's Charles Matthews as an older man. He would have started the company probably right after he finished his apprenticeship as a gem cutter, using the same type of machines that we've seen evolving. So that same hand crank bench that was already in London in the 1400s that we just saw through the help of John Mawe got this jam peg. So we're about 60 years after John Mawes died. This has become the most dominant machine style in London. This is what everybody's using professionally. Today, if we wanted to see one of these, original one of these, there's only one left. It's not in London. It's this one, which is in Derbyshire at Cock Abbey. Thank you. If you go to Cock Abbey, you can see this, but if you ask anybody in Cock Abbey where it is, they have no idea because they don't know what this is. I've talked to them about it before. It's in a cupboard at the end of the tour. I mean, you can see it, but it's like in a closet that you can't go into. You can just peek your head in. But it does still exist from this same late 1800s period. There's Chas Matthews' shop, and you can see that building is the same, but this one's been redone probably in the 50s. But that was the original Charles Matthews shop, selling gemstones, cutting stones. And Charles Matthews was, like John Mawe, he was into the world of cutting, but he was also very much what we would call today in the world of gemology, though that didn't exist yet. So he was an expert of stones. He was going to different mines. He was doing consulting work. So when they originally found emeralds in parts of Africa, he went there. He went to Burma to look at rubies. He went to, he probably went to Thailand to look at rubies. You know, he was going all over the world, bringing stones back, and then he was writing articles about them in gemology magazines that came later. So he starts his company in the 1890s. And by the time we get to the 40s, at some point his son Reg comes into the business, and that's Reg. Reg took over whenever Charles retired, and so he's Charles Reginald Matthews. But since his father was Charles, he's Reg, but it's still going to be Chas Matthews' company. So for a while, it's father and son. They split the company into two parts, I think in 41. Reg is not a cutter. He's handling buying and selling stones. Charles is handling the cutting business, and then eventually when Charles retires, Reg hires another guy to handle the cutting part. So we can see some images from this early 1900s period. So we got the classic jam peg that John Mawe showed us. This is actually a cutter who's on Bond Street, but it's the exact right period. So this is what they would have been looking like, hand cranking with the jam peg machine. And now, even though we've already established that the jam peg is French, and the techniques that they've conglomerated are coming from Portugal and Spain and the Netherlands and everywhere else, and France. But at this point, I think we can say that this has become a truly British style, and the shape of their jam peg is no longer the shape that the French ones have or the German ones have. The British have their own way of doing it, their own kind of stuff. And so I think by the time we get to Chas Matthews, we can say this is a British, through and through. It is what it is. This is a collection that's in the Natural History Museum. So you can see this is on display today, and this picture of Reg is part of the display. That's where I found that. So if you guys want to go see some of the stones that Chas Matthews Company actually cut, they're on display right now in the museum. And It's a free museum, so you can go check it out. That's the exhibition, so you can see the stone cases here. There's a bit about Charles Reg Matthews. And so when Charles Matthews retires, Reg is now the sole owner, but Reg doesn't know anything about cutting. So he needs somebody to manage the cutting part, and so he hires this guy. This is George Bull Diamond. So this is actually up in the building that used to be there. I guess we could say this is like the third generation. Charles, Reg, George Diamond. George Diamond eventually takes over the company when Reg retires, and you can see him here with that same hand crank machine doing the exact way that the British do it. So there's a couple photos from the 1960s from Chas Matthews in this third wave, and we've got this guy, Victor Richardson, who is a cutter. So Chas Matthews was here 1890s, 1930s, 1950s. I think in the maybe in the late 80s, this huge company that was maybe 20 or 30 cutters at a time in the 60s gets whittled down and whittled down. Well, in the 70s, the import VAT was established, and that devastated the London trade. A lot of cutters just left. When it was first introduced, if you wanted to send stones into London to get cut, they had now to go through import duties, which that doesn't work for gem cutters because then they're going to re-export them and they have to do it again. So that killed the trade, and a lot of cutters moved to Geneva and they never came back. And then around the same time, 1964, Thailand starts cutting. So that's suddenly a huge competitor for all of Europe. So you've got these two things right back to back that really devastate the Hatton Garden community. And the Chas Matthews guys told me that they wrote a strongly worded letter saying to the government saying, if we can't import the stones, then we need to do our business, then we're going to just export ourselves to another country. And they were actually the first company to get, I forget what it's called, but it was like a special status where you didn't have import duties on because of the type of business that you were. There was a special name for it, but I forgot it. But so they were one of the first people to get that because of this strongly worded letter that they wrote to the government. By the time that we get to this last generation who inherits the company, the fourth wave, there's really only a couple of people left. Like in the 60s, I think there was about 12. And the whole idea of the Charles Matthews Company was it was meant to be the best of the best of the best. They wanted to get the best faceting people, the best carvers, the best cabbers, the best everything, so that you have this super center of lapidary work in one place. And if you needed the highest kind of work done, you knew that you could go to Charles Matthews and get it done. And that was a reputation that they had, for 125 years. They just closed this year, right? Charlie and I went to go see them right before they closed, like the month that they closed. I flew out here because I knew I wouldn't probably see him again. Charlie came with me. And, we and then we came back and visited him again. Well, you did the day that they actually moved out. No, we're going to walk over to our next stop. We can just do that now because it's just right down here. But so Charles Matthews was in 4 different places along the street, but I didn't think we needed to see all 4. But that was the first one, which doesn't exist anymore. And then the last one's right down here. They went from this 1960s almost last golden era where they've got all these different experts, and eventually those old guys retire and no one really steps in to take the place, and there's just stuff happens in the company where everything gets split up, and then eventually it just comes down to these last 2 guys, and they're the last 2 that just closed this year. So it just ended with the 4th generation of the company. So this is Peter and John. They are the last 2. For at least, I think, 30 years, they were occupying basically where that fluorescent light is right there. That was their office. And then if you would go back on the other side of the building, they had another room that was the gem cutting room, which is this room here. So this is looking into the back alley over the building. And so they're still sitting there with their hand crank machine and their, exactly that jam peg thing that I just showed you. So it's really that same old style that John Mawe showed us in 1820. They haven't really changed anything. Nobody has changed anything. Yeah, the scale. They don't really use that scale. That's just an old one. The only thing that they've added really is they've got an electric light. They're still sitting in front of the windows the way that lapidaries always have to get the most light, but they've got an electric light over their over their space. And so this is them working this. So the polishing, they're doing by electric motor, but the cutting guy who's on the other side, Peter, he's still doing with the hand crank machine. So we do have some innovation that came in, I guess, in the 50s. They switched over to electric polishing wheels. And so we can see, though, if we see the photos of that guy, the cutter from Bond Street in 1901, it looks exactly what they're doing today. And if we would even go back to probably around the time of John Mawe, it wouldn't really look much different. The clothes would be more different than the cutting machines. This is one of the stones that they cut, that they gave me. It's a synthetic sapphire that they did for a museum display, but I took it home and I was able to really do a nice photo and measure all the angles and see exactly how they're doing it. Okay, so I want to talk about one more thing, but we're going to go to Gemé to make that talk, and then we're going to be, through the pub. So Hatton Garden, we didn't really say too much about it, but if you haven't been here before, this is the jewelry manufacturing center of London. It has been since the middle of the 1800s. Slowly, it also is fizzling like Chas Matthews. There's not very many cutters here today, but at one point there was a ton. If we go back to the 50s, this would have been one of the major gem cutting hubs of the world. So you would have had emeralds coming in from Colombia, rubies coming in from Burma, sapphires coming in. Really, the top stones of the world would have been coming to this neighborhood and being cut by Chas Matthews or one of these other companies. And then after work, they would come and have drinks at one of the oldest pubs in the city. One of the reasons why London became such a powerful hub of gem cutting, besides the fact that it's just a big city that has lots of stuff, but the story of gemology has a lot to do with it, and that's why we're ending at Gemé. So if you guys don't already know, Gemé is the oldest gemology school in the world, 1908, right? So if we just imagine that one block away we've got Chas Matthews, some of the best gem cutters of their time in the world, and a bunch of other really good gem cutters along this way, one of the reasons that makes those guys so good is their access to the information that other gem cutters just didn't have. Now, if we go back, we're still in the story of Chas Matthews. If we go back to the beginning of Chas Matthews' career, so we've got this advertisement. This is 1893, so this is before Gemé existed, but there's already this, congregation of people that will later start Gemé. The sort of the fathers of the whole thing, getting together and doing these little meetings around London. And Charles Matthews was one of those guys. He wasn't involved in starting the Gemé. They didn't have the formal school yet, but this picture, it even says down here, we are indebted to Mr. Charles Matthews of Hatton Garden for permission to use this illustration. So Charles Matthews was intertwined with all of the people that started Gemé. He was right here when it happened. He was just the same age as those guys, and they were all together. So when he starts his gem cutting company, and as he's training his apprentices and everything, the principles of gemology are part of the training. It's not just anymore, here's how you're going to cut a stone. We're understanding refractive index and critical angles and optics and hardness of different stones, mineralogy, all the stuff that we learned from John Mawe's books and from the people that came later are all just sort of getting crystallized into what's happening with the cutters of Hatton Garden. And so I think this is the first Gemé lab back in 19-teens. Because Gemé is here, because gemology education started here, the cutters here were the first ones to be able to have access to that information. If they weren't doing their research, reading those old books from the 1800s, they didn't need to, because they're in this cluster of people that are talking about gemology, that are thinking about gemology, and that are pushing the whole thing forward. And that's why London, now and then, had some of the world's best gem cutters, because not only did they have a mastery of the tools that they were working with, but they also had the intellectual knowledge that gem cutters need to have in order to make good stones. So this is the first, even before the name of the Gemological Association was made, this is the first diploma, 1913.
Cool. 13, okay.
Yeah. And just a couple of the founding fathers, these would have been friends of Charles Matthews Sr. So G.F. Herbert Smith, Basil Anderson, all of these guys. Over the last hour and a half, almost 2 hours, we've gone from the 1400s We've gone through Cheapside, the Cheapside Hoard, through the Strand, the shopping district, seeing the evolution of the gem cutting trade through the technology, through the evolution of the designs, and also just the cultural movement of people around the city. And then finally, when we get the birth of the Gemology school and the knowledge that's getting infused into the garden, we come till today. And as I said, Chas Matthews just closed this year after 125 years of continuous business. So a bit of a sad story, but the city continues as it did after the fire and after the immigrants came and went and everything else. The city just keeps on going. So here we are in post-COVID. Gem A still goes on, and the cutters are still cutting stones scattered around somewhere up here. And that is the end of our tour. Thank you guys so much. I appreciate the time and choosing to spend your morning walking around with me. That was fun.